Hello. Welcome to episode number 9 of Music as a Metaphor. I'm Lyndall Descant, tuning in today from the sunny state of California. This is actually pre-recorded today, so hopefully it goes without a hitch, and the date that it will be airing, even though it's a recorded episode, will be April 23rd, 2004. Now, I have to mention, last week I did do an episode went very in-depth into spiritual warfare for quite some time, and then sort of bounced around on some other topics, including the major scale and its counterpart, the relative minor scale, only to find out that there was some kind of glitch, and not only did it not really air, I think except for a few minutes in the beginning or the end, I don't know, because it also did not record. So episode 8 happened. I'm not sure anybody heard it but me, but we're going to go ahead and call this episode 9 anyways. And the interesting thing about it is I'm not really sure that I'm going to go back and do that in-depth discussion about spiritual warfare or not. After that happened, it led me to think a couple of ways about it. One way was that maybe I was over the target, right? And the spiritual warfare somehow glitched out the electronics, because if you really look into spiritual warfare, you can recognize very quickly that electronics seem to be, kind of this in-between zone, like a much easier realm, some kind of in-between realm. I mean, a lot of people are saying like it's a portal, right, to other realms, or it's being developed that way. That's an interesting way, and I've certainly myself recognized that, or I guess that is my own personal belief. So the fact that it glitched out, it was like, well, maybe it was because I was really spot on with what I was saying, and sometimes people say that you're on the target if they're coming after you for stuff, then maybe you're actually over the target, as opposed to people who get no issues, right, broadcasting or doing different things. But that could also be paranoia. And it could also have been, from another side, could also be just the fact that maybe I was straying a little bit too far from the topic of music as a metaphor. So I'm going to table that discussion for now. That's not going to be in episode 9, but what we are going to talk about in episode 9 is a couple of interesting things. First of all, just somewhat, it is kind of along the lines of spiritual warfare, but just dealing with your own triggers that might be happening. I'm kind of walking in real time through a moment that I had a big trigger happen, and how I was kind of processing that. And so that'll be the beginning discussion of this episode. And then we're going to get into a wonderful discussion on the major scale. And this time I'm going to get a little bit more in depth to the actual modes and how major scales are really the foundation for Western music. So those are the main topics for today, but I want to mention that in order to get this out, life has been rather busy and rather full on with many other things. And I even mentioned on the show last week that nobody heard, that I wasn't sure I was even going to be able to get episodes out this next couple of weeks. But by the handiness of my little phone and talking, as I've seen many people do before, but I've never done when you're in traffic, I've actually been able to get this episode, and hopefully we'll get it up just in time to air today for 5 p.m. Eastern. So that's why some of the quality of the sound is not as good. I'm experimenting with this, but this was the way I could get it out. So you'll hear that. You'll hear traffic. Some of it I'm sitting in traffic. A lot of it I'm sitting in traffic. And you'll hear some things. So apologies for that, but that just sort of explains that. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get ready. But I do want to mention that at the very end today, we're going to do a little bit of active listening. It's a meditation that I'm going to put together, set to a song I wrote a very, very long time ago called Trust Improvisation 1. And along with that is a little meditation, an insight that I had regarding reverence. So without further ado. Hello. So in traffic and thinking about this concept of keeping your calm in the storm. There is, I speak a lot about that with like let it all crumble, trying to be okay when things around you aren't the way you want them to be, but still have a sense of peace. But I just went through something today, and it was really hard. It was one of those moments where it was incredibly, incredibly difficult. I got super triggered, and in reality didn't end up having the control, the self-control, to keep my mouth shut. Now, what I'm not sure about is if I had kept my mouth shut, would things have been entirely different? Maybe. Did I sort of go into, so was that my own sort of sin? Did I have to sort of face the consequences of that with what ensued after? Or was this one of those setups that was supposed to happen because I had things in me that needed to come to the surface? And mainly it was a lot of anger that I haven't been looking at. It was there when I look back now. I can see how there was moments where I could have recognized that I was having some anger come up about a particular issue, but I really thought I had it under control, I guess. But in this moment, either I had a lack of self-control and I let the emotions take over, or it was meant to happen so that I would face something that I wasn't wanting to face. I guess two could actually be the same thing, because maybe part of self-control means being honest with ourselves and dealing with these things before they get, before you walk into a situation with what felt like the perfect setup to be triggered, and I fell for it. And that's why it was very hard. And when I did that, I regained within it was like maybe 1 or 2 minutes of going down a rabbit hole, not like really losing my temper, but standing up for myself in a situation that I know better than to stand up for myself. Because even though I think it was warranted, and this is another way we get baited into things, right? It was warranted that I stand up for myself, but in reality, given the situation, it won't really do any good. It's not really strategically the best option to do that in this particular circumstance. So, and I knew that going in, and yet I still ended up doing exactly that. This also brings in this idea of like when we try to use our self-control and our discipline, and then we just yo-yo back the other way, which does actually seem to be part of the human condition. Something I'm doing as well. It's like you try so hard to stay off of something for your health, and you actually do really good at it, and you feel great and self-righteous, and then you fall off, and then you actually go all the way the other extreme, and you have to really sit with it and recognize, did I yo-yo? Like, is it possible to really walk the line? Like, how does this work? And I guess that's where Jesus comes in, and the idea that, you're in the human condition, and you do have to accept whatever happens, including in my case, when you don't have self-control, right? You have to even accept that and not go to a place of berating yourself or beating yourself up, because that is going to disempower you, and that's going to pull you off your path. So you have to immediately accept whatever's in front of you. That's the game, and then try to get past it. Now, in my particular situation, it took me and I'm still not over it, but I'm going to say, how many hours is it now? Almost 6 hours of just physical, emotional. This was a deep one. Let's put it that way. Like, I feel sick to my stomach. This gets at the heart of some super core issues for me. And so I was trying to be appreciative, because in reality, if I really look at it, even though the day didn't go the way I wanted, if it was a day that was meant to be spent bringing this to the light of consciousness and recognizing I have this in me, recognizing I have a hatred and a bitterness in me that has to be brought to God. Because any bitterness, any resentment, any of that we hold on to, it's not about the other person. We might be justified, and we might not be. It doesn't really matter. What matters is that you clear it, because that is a definite, doorway in for manipulation and influence, and being controlled from dark forces if you are holding on to something like that. And I have to admit that now. And maybe if I had had more self-control today, that would have just gotten me another day, but I wouldn't have been humbled to the point of recognizing that I can be controlled, because I do have a lot of hatred in me regarding a certain scenario. And I felt miserable feeling this. It felt absolutely terrible, and it was in the middle of what was supposed to be a wonderful, relaxing day. Now, the wonderful, relaxing part of the day did enable me to just be with it, and it was easier than maybe getting triggered like that and then having to work or teach or, do something. But sometimes that I snap out of it even quicker when I'm serving other people. Serving other people or thinking other people can be sometimes a good way to pop out of it, but also sometimes you're just stuffing it back down and you're not dealing with it. The day I had forced me to really sit with it, and I have been, and I still am. And I was able to release and really get to the bottom of some things I'm feeling. Now, I don't know what it means for my life, but all through this, I have been able to anchor in and just pray to the power of Jesus in my life to bring these things to the light and to have them get healed. And that is the work. I wanted to talk about this from a raw place because that is the work. I was so triggered, for the most part, I couldn't sing. I was also so triggered that in reality, I didn't even want to drink, even though that was actually an option. And sometimes that is very tempting when you're that triggered to just numb out. And sometimes that's what you have to do, right? Sometimes you just can't, you have to take the edge off. Whatever you're experiencing is that bad. But when possible, you want to be able to go through the thick of it, and you want to have Jesus right there with you. And you want to have the faith that by doing that that's all you need to do, that you can accept the reality of whatever's going to come from what feels like, something that's spun out of your control. Or in my case, there was also a lot of guilt and anger. But it wasn't just guilt and anger that particular day, that if I had just kept my mouth shut, if I had been more self-controlled, then everything would have been fine. But the truth is that's not true. And I could have beaten myself up way more with that thought. It was there. It was pretty prominent. Like, you ruined the day for everybody, and you should have just kept your mouth shut. But all that is also coming from a place that I'm trying to look at, a codependent place, that I'm the one who picks up the slack every time, everywhere. That I'm the one that has to get it right. That I have this expectation on myself, and it's not a fair standard, and it's not being applied to the people around me. And that's part of what I'm rebelling against. I'm rebelling against the fact that it feels like I'm in certain enmeshed situations where I'm expected to pick up the slack. I'm expected to be the bigger person all the time. And it's just not fair, because I'm at the same time getting kicked in the gut, having things happen that are incredibly hurtful, and I'm not supposed to react. I'm not supposed to have any feelings about that, right? So that's not good to do to yourself. That's not fair to do yourself. And people around me are reflecting back to me sort of this unfair situation that I need to be honest with myself about, because I'm asking myself to deal with some pretty tough stuff. I'm having some pretty challenging and tempting situations in my life. And to imagine that I'm going to get it right every time, and I'm never going to lose my self-control, and that other people can't step up, that other people can't be the bigger person sometimes, and if I'm in a bad place, pick up the slack for me, that's really the scenarios that I'm looking for. And in order for that to be the case, I have to give it to myself. So it's taken about 6 hours. I'm giving myself that right now and just saying, you know what? You did the best you could today. You went into battle knowing you could get triggered, and sure enough, you sure did get triggered, and sure enough, looking back, my response was disproportionate to what was actually said. But from another side, hallelujah, that I can see that I have been harboring some very deep, dark anger. And it's not going to go away by myself. I need the supernatural help. I need the gospel. I need to understand that it's not, that I don't need to be perfect, that it's not about me being perfect. It's about me having the faith that what Jesus did for us was enough, and that we continually die to ourselves every day, but we're also resurrected through him, and that he can even resurrect this situation if I will bring it to him, if I will let him in, that he will resurrect me. And there will be a point where naturally I have more self-control, where naturally I don't get triggered. But until that day, he's right there with me. He's sanctifying me. He's reminding me that this is the human condition, that even when you know, hallelujah, the end result is that at some point we'll be past all this. At some point there's love. That going through betrayal is very difficult. Going through pain is incredibly difficult. And that what you're dealing with in your life is your cross. And that you can, you need to pick it up, but walk with Jesus. It's better than the alternative, I'll tell you that, which you could easily do. I think a lot of people are picking, like vacating their bodies, vacating their lives, just escapism. Even like maybe they're actually choosing to just go ahead and go the easy route and align with the fallen world and the matrix. And maybe that's the choice that they want to make for themselves. And so what are you going to do about it? How are you going to live? That's the only choice you really have. You can't do anything, can't save the people around you. And you're not going to be perfect all the time in this world we live in right now. You just got to practice every day. Practice every day. Just like with music, this work is practice. And some days you're just not going to make it. Some weeks you're not going to make it. But as soon as you can, you got to pick yourself back up and get on the horse. So it feels like a lot of people are getting drunk lately. It feels like there's a lot more escapism. But I'm thankful that I had Jesus with me today. I'm thankful that sometimes it's hard to think of what I'm thankful for. But what I'm looking to do is raise my frequency, because I've spent a little bit of time. I've given myself some time here, about 6 hours, to really feel, to heal. And it's still there. I'm sure it's still going to be coming in waves. But I also think I can't, ruminate on this and let this take over, because in reality, it's very possible that the other people that I'm so guilty that I ruined their day or that I did this, they don't really care. And I think that's part of what's hard for very caring, deep people to recognize, is that there might be just not the same level of reciprocation, and that you don't waste your time, don't waste caring about people that are caught up in whatever they're caught up in, and instead focus on the open doors that God has for you. And if there's none, then focus on your relationship with him, because we are loved and we are not perfect. None of us are perfect. And truthfully, most of us are dealing with some pretty tricky stuff where we might not even be aware of, because the layers are so thick. So see if today you can work on that right relationship with God, which will ultimately result in a right relationship with yourself, and that you can use whatever happened to you today to do that. Okay, major scales. Dun, 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 dun. This is an informal talk on major scales. And this is because this is about informing both musicians and non-musicians, talking about it from a place that maybe even people who play major scales haven't thought of. But truthfully, I'm seeing a lack of that these days in music education. I don't see a lot of scales being taught. I don't see a lot of theory. And that is also historic, because there's many people who are decent, and I'll speak only from piano, because piano and voice are the main instruments that I'm involved in. But a lot of times when you have classical music, you just don't have an understanding. You don't need to understand the theory. The way that classical music has been taught, it's really just notes on the page, incredible dexterity in the fingers, maybe some interpretation. So it's not to belittle it, but there's also generally, I've taught many students who grew up and play classical music decently and don't really understand what I'm about to talk about with major scales. Now, major scales are important. I realized that actually when I was young, it was the same thing. I mean, I learned classical music from somebody who played organ at the Houston Symphony, and she was a wonderful teacher, but she really didn't get outside of the box of teaching, and so she never acknowledged any of the songs I was making up, which granted were just little ditties, but still. Nowadays, my practice is if I have a student making up songs, that's something to take note of and start to put some sunshine on. And from Reggio Emilio, you start to hold their hand and see how far do they want to go with that, right? Maybe they're just somebody who likes making up ditties. Maybe there's somebody who actually has a capacity. This is the seeds or the start of them composing more, writing songs. So you explore it more. Well, this was sort of ignored, it was like not part of what she wanted to look at. And scales, we did learn scales, I want to say, but there was no practical application to what we were learning, the theory. And we had a once a week theory class, but it was theory in this situation was relegated to learning how to read music, basically. And some people, I think more in the classical music, maybe even Suzuki, I'm not sure about that, those type of worlds, they do think of theory that way. But to me, theory is more maybe the way jazz defines it, where you're talking the nuts and bolts of how songs are created and what is making up our music. You're looking for the patterns behind the music. So that's where major scales come in. It's been on my radar since I was an adult. As I was mentioning, when I grew up classical, we learned the scales, but it wasn't the theory of it. But the scale theory became very important when I was super into listening to Fish. I also had a good friend who took the time to explain this theory, major scale theory, modal theory. I remember we were somewhere and he wrote it on a napkin, and it just blew my mind, because suddenly I could see the structure behind music. It wasn't such this infinite place of notes and songs and where do you even begin? It was like, because in reality, major scales are a huge part of the foundation of the music that we listen to. And Mike Gordon, the bassist for Fish, he was on something back then, and they were like, what would you tell aspiring musicians? And he was like, learn your major scales, like never stop playing them, like always major scales. So that stuck with me, and it always was part of my own practice as an adult. And then when I went to jazz school, it only became more a part of that, even though they branch out further from just the major scales. But in reality, if you're not just focused on jazz and you are interested in all styles of music or certain ones that I'm about to mention, then knowing your major scales is 80% of what you need to know. Okay, because here's why. There's 12 major scales because there's 12 keys in Western music. We're talking specifically about Western music. Western music, the smallest interval between two notes is a half step, and the piano demonstrates this very well. Whether you're moving between a white to black or black to white or white to white, you really never can move from black to black. But when you're moving from any colored key to another one, the very next one to it, you're moving in a half step. And this is an interval. It's a small interval. And the major scale is a certain pattern of half steps and whole steps, which is when you put two of them together. And the whole step is a little bit more of a pleasing sound to our ears. But that major scale includes two half steps. So the interval pattern that it follows is whole step, half, whole step, half. That is a major scale. And if you start on any one of the 12 unique keys that we have in Western music, then you come up with 12 unique major scales. Melodies are in the most basic, but also the most historic form. A melody is coming from that major scale. And the major scale could be corresponded with the idea of a key of a song. So if I hear a melody and I want to put it in a different key, I'm basically flipping from one major scale to another. Meaning that the notes, the 7 notes of that scale, which repeat over and over again at different octaves, those are the only notes that are in my palette for my melody. I'm only going to pick out of that palette, okay? Once again, stay with me. I'm talking about it historically in a simplistic form, but it makes it easier because everything is variations off of this now, if you can get this template in your head. So I have a major scale, like let's say I decide I want to do it in the key of C, because on the piano, the key of C is the all white notes. The whole step, half, whole step, half pattern lines up perfectly on the white notes. So this is why many beginner pianists only play in the key of C, because you can take any song and move it to that key and it's easier for them to play, right? Because the white notes are thicker and easier to play than the black notes. Every other major scale, in order to keep that pattern, has to involve at least one black note. So this is why, this is how to think of key. This is how major scale corresponds with key. And as singers, one of the things I've been talking about very recently is the idea that when you don't know much about singing, you think you're supposed to just be able to sing any song in any key. But the more you know about music, the more empowered you are to actually take a melody and put it in the right key for your voice, right? And it's still going, for the most part, most people today are not sensitive to keys. So if I take a song, let's say Adele's I Set Fire to the Rain, I think that's originally an A. I think a lot of her music is an A. And then, but I want to play it on the piano for one of my students who is just starting out, so I'm going to put it in C, right? Most people actually listening to it, maybe they hear something a little different, maybe it sounds a little brighter, but it doesn't even, just because, you know, if you got to keep in mind that it's not just like C is above A, it's a minor third above A, because it can also be a sixth below, right? It can go both directions. So it's not where, it depends on where you're singing it or where you're playing it. It doesn't necessarily make it higher or lower, but it can sound brighter, or it can sound a little different for some people. But because music education has been going down for decades in this country, in America at least, people are not as sensitive to that. And before the tuning that came about with Bach, which was the well-tempered clavier type of tuning, equal temperament, before that, keys actually had much more character to them. They actually did sound quite different, but you'd have to retune for different keys. The well-tempered method, what that did was make it so we don't have to retune in between keys, but certain keys, you know, if I want to go on a piano from C, then I want to play a song in A, then I want to play a song in F sharp, no problem, right? I don't have to retune in between each one. But there's also some cheating going on in order to do that. You don't have as perfect of intervals, such as the fifth or the octave. I'm not actually sure if, I'm just saying examples of intervals. I'm not sure if those are the ones that are cheated or not, but you have to cheat a few to kind of get that there. So back in the day, the keys themselves had a much stronger quality. So major scales, that the melody in songs in their most simplistic form would be a melody that's made out of this major. I have 7 notes in a major scale, and I come up with a pattern. A melody is one note at a time, and I come up with a pattern using only those 7 notes, but I can use them at any octave, right? So I might be singing an octave. I might have 2 different C's, etc. in this. The harmony is the other part to the song, okay? The harmony is what is being played like with chords. So more than one note played at a time is a chord or a harmony, and that is meant to support the melody, and that also comes out of the major scale. Because if you play a triad, which is the most fundamental building block of a lot of Western music, historically speaking, up until when jazz got really into 4-chord voicings or shell voicings of 7th chords. But even there, triads are embedded in it. The triad is the basic building block, and it's a 3-note chord where you just simply skip over. Like, let's say you're playing it as a pianist would play it, but triads are in all instruments. My pinky, my middle finger, and my thumb would be playing a note, and the notes that would be under my 4th and my 2nd finger, I'm skipping those. So I'm skipping over a third. It's made up of a major third and a minor third on top. So that's a triad. So basically it's a 3-note voicing. It's hard for me to put that in, and they're played all at the same time, and that's a triad. Now, if I start at the beginning note of my scale, let's say C, and I play a triad where my lowest note is a C, and then I skip over and I hit the next one, then I skip over and I hit the next one. That's my triad, right? A C, E, G triad. That's a C major triad. That is in the Ionian mode of C. That's my 1 chord. But let's say I shift over, and now I'm at D, and I do the same exact shape in my hand. So I'm skipping over, I'm going D, and then I'm skipping over to the F, and then I'm skipping over to the A. So I've skipped the E and I've skipped the G, and I've got another triad. That is still in the key of C, because I'm only allowing myself to play the notes in the key of C. Okay, I'm still only on the white notes, but now it's a minor chord, and it's actually called a D Dorian, or a triad. So this is where we start to get the harmony from. The harmony is basically I call them modal chords. They're basically creating triads from different notes in the scale. So let's do the same thing from the 3rd note. The E is the 3rd note of the key of C. I build a triad off of that. What do I get? Well, I get a minor triad. I get an E minor triad, because I'm using all the white notes, and by doing that, it's not the same as what an E major would be, because an E major would have a G sharp. I have a G natural here, so that means it's not the black note, it's the white note. That gives me a minor. Well, once again, that's a great chord to use up under a melody that I'm playing in C. It's going to work pretty nicely with it's not going to work with every note in the melody. Some are better than others, but it's where you want to go to kind of shop around for what chord you want, okay, if you want a minor sound. Next, we get to the 2 most popular chords used from this. That is the 4 chord, which you might have heard of. That is starting at the F, we're skipping over the G, we're hitting the A, we're skipping over the B, we're hitting the C. So that is a F major triad, and that is our 4 chord in the key of C. That is used a lot, okay, especially in blues. Kind of really got used a lot in blues, but also in classical music all the way back, okay? Then we get to the 5 chord, the 5th note of the C scale. C, D, E, F, G is G. And if I build a triad off of that, I get a G triad, I get a G major. And this is called the mixolydian, or the dominant chord. This is the most fundamental interplay between 2 chords in music, the 5 to the 1. So my 5th chord to my 1 chord is basically used in almost every piece of music. Now, back in the day, that might be all you have. That might have been the chord movement under a melody, okay? Historically speaking, and in folk, and even going back to like Gregorian chant, that was some of the movement happening there. Nowadays, most things aren't as simplistic as that, but as we're going to talk about it in a minute, pop music is still quite simplistic. And in most music, you're going to have a 5 chord, even though it might be decked out as a 7th chord, but we'll get into that later. So let's keep moving to the modes of the scale. Next is the 6th note of the major scale is A. And so when we build a triad off of that, staying only with our notes in C, what we're going to get is an A minor, and this is the 6th minor. This is also where, if we were to play a scale, like an A to A scale, but only using the C the parameters of C major, so only using those white notes because that's all we've got in C, right? We're not stepping out of the key of C, but we're not going C to C for a scale now, which is our major scale. We're going A to A, the 6 to the 6. What do we get? Well, we get the relative minor. Relative minor. Yes, sir. This is a very important relationship between the 6 and the 1. This is probably the most popular minor scale that we use because we, unlike the major scale, we don't have just one major. I mean, we don't have just one minor. Major, we have one major. Okay, that's it. That's why it's such a great foundation to work with. But there's more than one minor we work with. This is arguably the most popular, and it is called the relative minor because it is also used in key signature. Like, for example, if I want a song in A minor, I'm going to give a C key signature, okay? We'll talk more about that at a different time for the key signature, but just think key, okay? But I start on the A, and that's how you know that it's actually A minor because it's the relative minor. Everybody knows this relationship. There's a lot of interplay in songs between moving from the major to its relative minor, okay? It can even be considered a type of modulation depending on how you handle it. So this is a very important relationship, and I've often used the idea of it's two sides of one coin, and I've also used it back in the day when I somewhat was absorbed in that idea of twin flame. Like, if there was only one other counterpart for you and they were your perfect match, but they were also your like divine opposite, that's what this would be like. This relationship is incredible between the major scale and its relative minor, as well as the 6 minor versus the 1 chord. This is a beautiful interplay. Before I talk about the very last chord, or in this modal chord situation out of the C major scale, I want to mention that in most pop music today, you're dealing with 4 chords: the 1, the 4, the 5, and the 6 minor, in some variation of that. And that is no lie. I'm not kidding. In fact, I just saw a super funny video about a girl who, I might try to re-put it on my page, that like was doing like she called it every Taylor Swift song, and she was singing exactly about moving from the 1, I think it was like the 1 to the 6 minor to the 4 to the 5, and she was super funny about it, and then got more into it, but I didn't see the whole video. So trust me, it's not just Taylor. I mean, honestly, most pop music is that way. The music in the 50s was that way. A lot of things besides jazz, you're going to be able to get away if you only know those 4 chords with actually learning quite a bit of music. And before I explain the last chord in there too, these chords are mostly, the ones we've already talked about, these 6 different chords are mostly what's being used in music too for the harmony. So you already have the basics right here, right? Now, granted, a song can be in any one of those 12 keys, but even there, in certain genres, they stick with certain keys over other ones, like country and rock and roll tends to be more like A and E and D, and well, country is more like G, but G's in there with rock and roll too a lot, especially classic rock. So you don't even really have to learn all 12 keys, which I don't advocate that, because I've always been kind of hardcore about learning all 12 keys and not even using the transpose button on the keyboard, which a lot of people are apt to do. But I also, at this point, whatever you got to do to get yourself playing some music, that's where I'm at these days. We need, as I've mentioned, good people with good hearts out there making music, whether it's for yourself or your family or your local cafe, or bigger and better. Who knows? I'm letting go of that rigid idea that you've got to know all 12 of your keys at this point. You don't. You can know one key, you can know one scale, and you can learn those 4 chords, and honest to goodness, you can do a lot with that, okay? Especially if you're a songwriter. The other thing I'm going to mention is that a lot of songs, like Beatles are a great example, where they might be largely that those 4 chords, but they typically do one interesting thing, and there's a lot of songs that do this. So I don't want to give the impression that every song is completely within its scale and scale/key and completely only uses those chords that we've mentioned that are within the key. Oftentimes there might be one moment in the song, like Hallelujah is a perfect example, where it steps out with like I think it's a 6 or a 5 major. Like it was in a minor. I can't remember. I can't honestly remember because I know it in different keys. But let's just say that rather than playing an E minor, which is what it needs to be, it plays an E major, and the melody kind of does something similar. A lot of songs do that. For 1 second, it might step up a half step out of it, and that brings attention to it, right? But there is a level of dissonance stepping out, and jazz does it all over the place, right? They're modifying. There might be several keys within a song in jazz. And classical music back in the day ended up, it would depend on the movement, right? But it was more complicated in the arrangement of it and the dexterity of being able to play it than it was necessarily of the key structure or even the chords. And they didn't really use 7 chords that much. They used a lot of triads, though they might be playing in like Lydian. So, and I'm not a classical music expert, so I really can't, I could be wrong on some of that. But for the most part, the classical music that I've played or I've analyzed largely has 1, 4, 5s in it. They're just, you have to play it exactly the way they tell it. Whereas in jazz and rock and roll and a lot of these things, you decide the voicing. They're going to give you the chord symbol, and they're going to tell you the melody, maybe on a staff, maybe you have to pick it up by your ear, and then you figure out the chords. They'll tell you what the chord symbol is, and then you figure out how you're going to play it. And that's your arrangement, that's your discretion, that's your voicing. So I want to mention that because I don't want, you might start playing a song and be like, wait, why can't I find this one key? So yes, not all songs stay completely within the key. Not all songs stay completely within those chords. The Beatles are a great example of how they would maybe be there 90% of the time, but then they'd always, every song brought something interesting and creative and unexpected. They were quite the songwriters for sure. So the last chord I want to mention is the B half diminished, okay? Or if you're dealing within a triad, it's just a diminished. And this one is because B is the 7th. We're using C as an example, but keep in mind you can do this in any key, starting at any place. But C is the easiest, especially if you're visualizing a piano, which maybe you have one in front of you, and this has been great to do. I'll mention that next time I try to bring this in, is that if you can even have a picture of a piano in front of you, it might be helpful to visualize. The piano is one of the best instruments for teaching music theory because it's so easy to visualize it. Okay, this stuff is a lot harder to see when you're dealing with fretboards, etc., right? But on the piano, it's one of the best parts about it, and why so many composers use it. It's just laid out linearly for you to look at. So if you start at C and you count up C, D, E, F, G, A, B is the 7th and last before we start repeating. And if you stay in the key of C, what you actually end up is a diminished triad. And let me back up and tell you something, that major triad, to go from a major triad to a minor triad, all you have to do is flatten that middle note by 1 half step, and you have a minor sound. That's it. One small half step difference between a major triad and a minor triad. The difference between a diminished and a minor is that not only do you flat the 3rd, you flat the 5th. And once again, I'm only speaking about triads right now. But triads can be embedded in other chords, or they are embedded. So if you understand this, and this is where I recommend people start, just understand the foundations of music. And then as you're building out from there, everything is just variations on that, right? Even learning other scales, most other scales and modes, once you know the major scale really well, it's a template in your head, you're thinking in terms of variations on that major scale, which is why I think Mike Gordon said that back then. Now, it's conjecture, but I think if you really understand your major scales and you really understand your major triads, now you're just dealing with 1 note variation, right? The template is there, and it's so much easier to deal with what feels like complexity in music, but becomes very quickly a simplified, easy way to understand. You really start to recognize that it's not nearly as complicated because it's variations and repetitions on template, mainly the major scale templates. So that is why, as a music teacher, I am super motivated for people to learn major triads and their corresponding chords. Major scales and their corresponding triads. That's what I'm trying to say. Major scales and your corresponding triads. Major scales and your corresponding triads out of the context of an actual song. If you can learn these and learn them, like really learn them, okay? And the fingering is important on them. Ew. The fingering is important. It's not just learning the notes. It's on piano, at least. And I only teach this on piano. the fingering is very important that you learn as well, but also you're learning more than the fingering. You're learning to the templates for the music that you maybe want to compose in, that you want to learn. And so now when you pick up even a classical piece, you're seeing these components and you already have the muscle memories in your hands. And so the two are coming together. You're not having to learn a fresh batch of, it's not like every single note is new and unique and you have to learn every single note as it comes as a new thing. No, you start to see the patterns. You start to then connect it with the muscle memory in your hand, and you start to have much more instantaneous type of playing. So this is one of the reasons why I really advocate for this. But even if you're not a musician, I hope you were able to stick with us through this, because just being able to understand music actually makes you a better listener, and it makes it more enjoyable, and to me, it's endlessly fascinating. So thanks for sticking with me on that.
Reverence. I'm understanding what reverence means. I'm not understanding it's not words on a page. Not anymore. God is so magnanimous. God is so huge. God is so beyond what we understand. And that's a good thing. You can trust him because he has our best interest at heart, because he knows us intimately, because he is personal and magnanimous at the same time. He is huge and tiny. He is a fractal. He is so beyond what we can comprehend. And that's why having reverence is so natural for him, because how else do you approach him except in reverence, knowing that if you remember that and you don't just try to bring him down to your size, then reverence is a natural response. And it's not something that I'm doing because I'm told I should be in reverence. I feel the reverence. It's natural.
Thanks for tuning in today to Music as a Metaphor with Lyndall Descant. I've got a video coming out this week. It's actually going to be a Lauren Daigle song. It's going to be a music video this Friday. I did it impromptu in a situation where my intuition was calling me to play this. And I heard it a few weeks back on that movie Redeeming Love, which was a book I read many years ago. Sorry, I just got a message asking me to go to Walmart. So I'm going to have to wrap it up here. But I will say that that book was based on the story of Hosea, I believe, in the Bible. And the book I really liked. The first time I saw the movie, I didn't really care for it. But when I saw it a few weeks ago, it just hit me so right. I think that it has such a profound message of the gospel there. So check out that video this Friday for some love. It's called I Will Rescue You. And if you're feeling down in the dark, if you're having a rough time, which I know many people are, even if you're not, just know that there's so much love out there. And the message of that song is I will rescue you. And God is doing his best to get to each and every one of us. So remember to check me out on Instagram, on YouTube, on Twitter. Trying to get my post out there, but really it's about spiritual warfare for me and reclaiming the space for the power of love. So I see you next time here on freeworld.fm. That's every Tuesday, 5 p.m. Eastern, and I'll be back next week one way or another. Can I keep from singing? While the tempest loudly roars, hear the truth delivered, though the darkness round me close. Songs in the night are given. No storm can shake my inmost calm. To that rock I'm clinging, since love is Lord of heaven and earth. How can I keep from singing? When tyrants tremble in their fears, hear their death knell ringing, when friends rejoice both far and near. How can I